Okay, today we're going to talk a little bit about the child tax credit and the calculation for that. I already given you a lecture on the child tax credit to give you an overview of what it entails. And now I'm going to focus more on the actual calculation of those figures. So just to start off, I know we've talked a lot about the IRS tax forms, but there are certain calculations that are actually what's called in publications. And the child tax credit and credit for other dependents is in a publication. You can notice here that this is publication 972. If you scroll down within that publication 972, you're going to find what's called a worksheet. And that worksheet is what I'm going to go over today. These numbers go over to child tax credit line 13A. If you look at the 1040 form, which is up here now, you'll notice that the other credits are also on the second page of the 1040 form. Some other ones that we have talked about. There's one down here called the American Opportunity Credit, right? We've already talked about that one. We haven't focused a whole heck of a lot on the second page here. So just to take a little picture walk, we have federal income tax withheld, other taxes from self-employment, things like that. Add Schedule 3, which we're going to talk about in the worksheet as well. But this child tax credit here and credit for other dependents is going on to line 13A. I know we've talked a lot about how individual forms, go to then a Schedule 1, 2, or 3, and then onto the 1040 form. Since this does not have an actual IRS form, but instead is embedded within a publication, it is actually going straight to the 1040 form. So let's look here at some numbers. Try to get this all the way up here, get as much as I can on the page. All right, let's say, for example, that we're gonna have 2 children and we're gonna get $4,000 for each of those children there. Let's also say that we have one other dependent, and we get potentially for $500 credit for that. And you'll see why I say potentially in just a second. Move this up a little bit. All right, and then on lines 1, 2, and 3, of course, we're going to add those together. On line 4, it asks you to enter the line from 1048B, and we're going to stick with the same number that we've been talking about all along, which is the adjusted gross income number of $50,000. On line 5, it asks us to enter a total of any of the exclusions from Puerto Rico and amounts from 1055. In my lecture, I had talked to you about the modified adjusted gross income figures. This is part of where that hits. It also hits when we talk about, I think it's on page 2, and I'll point that out for some of the other residential credits and things like that. So this is what we're talking about when I talked about the modified adjusted gross income. This modifies this adjusted gross income. We're going to say we have none of these. So on line 6, then, we're just going to enter our $50,000. On line 7, we enter the amount shown below for the filing status. In our examples, we've talked about that our taxpayer is single, so we're going to put in $200,000. In your lecture, I had spoken about how the limit is very liberal and very accepting for almost anybody, and you can see why that is here. That amount for the filing status diminishes entirely after $200,000, and that is a graduated. I talked a little bit about the graduated table. We're not going to focus on the graduated table. Just know that that limit there for single is $200,000 and $400,000 if you're married filing jointly. On line number 8, it asks you whether the amount on line 6 is more than the amount on line 7. It's not. So we're going to leave this one, enter 0 on line 8 and 0 on line 9. Now, notice that when I scroll up, it's going to not take our numbers with us, of course, because this is not a PDF fill-in form like some of the other ones that we've done. So I'm going to have to just remind you what the line items are when we get there. All right, let's talk about line 8. We are going to talk about here on line 8, remember this was a no, so this was left blank. And line 9, it asks us to put in a 0 amount. Great. On line 10, is the amount on line 3 more than the amount on line 9? I'm going to remind you, since that's not up there, the amount on line 3 was $4,500, which was the 2 dependents and the 1 other dependent. We got 4,000 for one and 500 for the other. So the question again, just to remind you, is the amount on line 3, that's the amount on 3, more than the amount on line 9? It is. Subtract, and there we go, right? Great. So let's move that on to the next page with this example. On line 11, we have a question that asks us, enter the amount from 1040, line 12B. I'm going to remind you or tell you what that is so I don't have to get out of my drawing mode here. That is the tax liability form or figure. So on line 1040, on form 1040, line 12B, that's the amount of tax liability that's automatically calculated for you. Let's say that we have a tax liability form or tax liability figure of 7,500. Line 12, and again, that's predominantly from your W-2, right? What was withheld minus what was calculated would give you whatever you owe, right? So this amount is before any amount that was withheld out of your W-2. This is just what the government has calculated based on your income. On line 12, it is asking us to add the following amounts from line 3, or schedule 3, which is line 1, 2, and 3. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to get out of this and go to line schedule 3. Notice that on schedule 3, lines 1, 2, 3, and 4, we've talked about 2 types of expenses on here. We've talked about the child for credit for child and dependent care expenses, and we've talked about the education credits. We're not going to talk about retirement savings or foreign tax credit because we just simply are not, don't have enough time in the classroom, and it's not any type of credit that is highly used. So let's, just a reminder, we'll go back to this form, which I've already wrote on, which is not going to be good because I have to rewrite it. Back here, I think we put in 7,500 here, I believe. And when we were talking about this, let's say we have child and dependent care expenses for line 12 of, for 2 children, we only work part-time maybe, so $5,000. So here we're going to subtract line 12 from line 11 here, and that brings that down to 2,500. And I want to kind of focus on what we've just done here. Remind you, this is what we had as a tax liability. These were our credits for child and dependent care credits or education credits. Notice that this is reduced by those. That's going to be a big part of what we're allowed to take in just a second. On line 14, it asks us, are you claiming any of these following credits here? Again, these are the things that are considered part of that modified adjusted gross income when it comes to this, because it, notice down here that if you say yes and no, there's very different figures that come out of that. We're going to say that we're not dealing with those here, and we're going to put a 0 because they're not too widely used. Subtract line 14 from line 13, and we've got 2,500 in that there. So what we've got now is that we take a reflection what just happened on page 1 of this. Remember that we came up with that credit on page 1 of 4,500, which was the 2 children and the 1 other non-dependent. And then we take this calculation here, which is your tax liability, less any credits that you had from this schedule here, and we come up with this number of 2,500. And notice how it's carrying down. That's going to play a big part when we start to get into determining which one we're going to be allowed to take, whether it be the credit from that we calculated from page 1 or the other credit, potential credit that we're calculating here with our tax liability. Let's move this down. I think we had, where were we here? We're gonna go here. This line was 2,500. 7,500 minus our 5,000. On line 14, we said no, we're not claiming any of those. And line 15, we brought this down because that was 0 in line 14. Line 16 asks, is the amount on line 10, I'm going to remind you that line 10 was from page 1, and it was the $4,500 amount. Is the amount on line 10 more than the amount on line 15? Yeah, it was, right? So in that case, enter the amount from line 15. Again, I want you to notice what happened here. The IRS is allowing either the full credit, but if you had any type of Schedule 3 deductions, the government is going, the IRS is going to say, hey, you know what, we're going to give you those credits, but we're not going to give you both the child tax credit that's not reduced, we're going to reduce it, or the child and dependent care expenses. So if you don't have any child dependent care expenses or education credits, you would have had this amount. All right. Let's do something similar to show you what happens with changes in income levels. So if we have an income level on line 6, let's say instead of $50,000 here, let's say we have an income level of $250,000. On line 7 then, we're actually going to use that. Enter the amount from here, same amount here. We're still single. And in line 8, this is where we get a little different. Is the amount on line 6 more than the amount on line 7? Where we said no previously, we're going to say yes now. And it says subtract line 7 from line 6. What's interesting here is I made it in multiples of 1,000, but if this was 251,000 or 252 or whatever it may be, that number would be different here. And what you need to do is bring that number up to multiples of 1,000. So if this was 251.3, this number would be rounded up. But I made this number very easy to calculate here. So line number 8, of course, the difference is going to be $50,000. In line 9, we didn't have to calculate this before because this number was $50,000. But now we are being asked to say multiply the amount on line 8 by 0.05 or 5%. And if we multiply $50,000 by 5%, that number is, let me think, is that number 2,500? Yep. 10% would be 50, so half of that would be 5,000, half of that would, yep, that's right. All right, so down here, we're down to line 9, where this was 0. Now we're up to $2,500 for line 9. On line 10 then, let's read that. Is the amount on line 3, remember that line 3 was 4,500, that didn't change. Still 2 dependents and 1 other. Is the amount on line 3 more than the amount on line 9? Is the amount on line 3 more than the amount on line 9? Yes, it is. Subtract line 9 from line 3 and enter the result here. If you recall with our other example in the $50,000, this number was not reduced. It was actually 4,500. So following that down here, we have very different numbers as well if we put in different tax liabilities, and I'll do that pretty quickly here. Let's say, for example, instead of $7,500, we had a tax liability of $10,000. Let's say that we had no child and dependent care expenses, and this number, of course, then would be $10,000 since it wasn't reduced. On line 14, we're going to say we're not claiming any of these credits, so this was 0, which means that on line 15, we just carry that down by $10,000. Okay, so line 15 is $10,000 because we didn't have any of those. Let's read what we have here in line, in line 16. Line 16, it asks us, is the amount on line 10, recall in this example was $2,000, is the amount on line 10 more than the amount on line 15? And we're going to say no, right? Enter the amount from line 10. So you notice there are several, what I wanted to point out is that there's several different ways that this can be, I don't want to say manipulated because that's not the right word, but accounted for depending on the types of Schedule 3 credits, the amount of tax liability that's calculated, the number of dependents and other dependents. So it's a pretty easy form to do. So I'm not worried for you guys about that. As you look down here as you scroll down, you're going to notice that there's another part of these worksheets or another line 14 worksheet, and then I think you're going to have an earned income worksheet. We're going to ignore those. We're just going to concentrate on the worksheet that's embedded in line 972. So what I would do is to study for this, I would practice this one on your own, understand where all of the numbers are going to go to, and then recognize, of course, that it doesn't go to a Schedule 3 like some of the other ones there, and recognize where it goes on to the 1040 form. So hopefully that gives you an understanding of what this form does. I also want to remind everyone that if you have questions, I will be online every Tuesday and every Thursday beginning at 9:25. You're welcome to join in. You're welcome to not join in. But if you have questions, I'm hoping to get those answered not through email, but through you guys taking the effort to log in as well. So please do that so that we can get everything answered and get you ready for the meeting, for the exam. Have a great week.